Today's story follows a young, enslaved boy who escaped into the Old West and, against all odds, became the most feared gunslinger in Texas. His past was erased, his name was buried, but his story survived. This is a harsh and intense journey through violence, survival, and transformation. Take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps ensure these stories are remembered, not erased. Let's begin. In the summer of 1873, a man dressed entirely in black walked into a saloon in Dusty Creek, Texas. He was tall, broad-shouldered. His skin was dark as midnight. His eyes carried something that made grown men look away. Within 60 seconds, he drew his revolver and put a bullet through the skull of a man named Thomas Birch. Before anyone could react, the stranger vanished into the blazing afternoon sun. That single gunshot would echo across Texas for the next 2 years. It was the first shot in a campaign of vengeance that would leave 18 men dead. It was the announcement that a ghost had returned to collect debts that white men thought were long forgotten. The shooter's name was Zachariah Creed, born a slave, escaped at 13, trained by a legendary Mexican gunfighter, hunting down every man who ever made him bleed. The newspapers called him a monster. The wanted posters called him dangerous. The slaves who still remembered him called him something else. They called him vengeance. To understand how Zachariah Creed became the most feared man in Texas, we need to go back to the beginning. Not to his birth, but to his mother's death. Because that is where his story truly starts. That is the moment when the boy named Zachariah died and something else took his place. The year was 1858. The place was a cotton plantation called Whitmore Estate, located about 40 miles west of Houston, Texas. The owner was a man named Colonel Henry Whitmore. He was not actually a colonel. He had never served in any military. But in the South before the Civil War, wealthy plantation owners often gave themselves military titles to sound more important. Colonel Whitmore owned 3,000 acres of land and 112 enslaved human beings. He was considered one of the most successful planters in the region. His cotton sold for premium prices in New Orleans. His name appeared in newspapers as an example of Southern prosperity. What the newspapers did not mention was how that prosperity was built. They did not mention the whippings. They did not mention the brandings. They did not mention the families torn apart and sold like cattle. They did not mention the bodies buried in unmarked graves behind the slave quarters. Colonel Henry Whitmore was a monster. But in 1858 Texas, monsters like him were called gentlemen. Zachariah was born on the Whitmore plantation in 1847. His mother's name was Abigail. She worked in the main house as a domestic servant, cooking meals and cleaning floors and doing whatever the white family demanded. Abigail was known for 2 things among the other slaves: her kindness and her voice. She sang hymns while she worked, old spirituals that her grandmother had taught her, songs about Moses and freedom and a promised land beyond the river. The other slaves said her voice could make you cry even when you did not understand the words. Zachariah grew up listening to that voice. It was the only beautiful thing in a world of ugliness. Abigail gave her son his name in secret, in the darkness of the slave cabin where they lived with 6 other families. Zachariah. It came from the Bible. It meant God remembers. She whispered it to him every night before sleep. "Your name means God remembers," she said. "He remembers every hurt, every tear, every wrong done to his children. And one day, he will make it right. You remember that, baby, no matter what they do to you. God remembers." Zachariah's father was sold to another plantation in Louisiana when Zachariah was 3 years old. He had no memory of the man, only the stories his mother told him. His father had been strong, a field hand who could pick 300 pounds of cotton in a single day. He had been sold because Colonel Whitmore needed money to buy more land. That was how it worked. Human beings were converted into acres. Fathers were turned into fields. Zachariah never saw his father again. Acres. Fathers were turned into fields. Zachariah never saw his father again. He never learned whether the man lived or died. That was slavery. You could lose everything you loved overnight, and no one would even tell you where it went. By the age of 5, Zachariah was already working. Not in the fields yet. He was too small for that. But there was plenty of work for small children on a plantation. He carried water to the field hands. He gathered eggs from the chicken coops. He swept the paths around the main house. He ran errands for the White family, fetching things and delivering messages. The Whitmore children, 2 boys and a girl around his age, sometimes threw rocks at him for entertainment. If Zachariah cried, he was whipped. If he ran, he was whipped harder. He learned very quickly not to cry. He learned to make his face a mask that showed nothing. This was his first lesson in survival. The head overseer on the Whitmore plantation was a man named Thomas Birch. He was not a wealthy man himself. He came from poor white stock, what the plantation owners called white trash behind their backs. But Birch had found his place in the world. He had discovered that he enjoyed hurting people, that he was good at it. Colonel Whitmore paid him well to maintain discipline among the slaves, and Thomas Birch earned every penny. He carried a whip made of braided leather with small metal weights woven into the tips. When it struck flesh, it did not just bruise, it tore. It left scars that never fully healed. Birch used that whip almost every day. He said it was necessary to maintain order, but anyone who watched him work could see the truth. He liked it. He smiled when he swung. He laughed when they screamed. Zachariah was 7 years old on the day his mother died. It was a Tuesday in August. The heat was brutal, over 100 degrees, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer like water. Abigail was working in the main house preparing dinner for the Whitmore family. She was carrying a large ceramic jug of milk from the kitchen to the dining room. The jug was heavy. Her hands were slick with sweat. It slipped. It fell. It shattered on the hardwood floor, sending milk spreading across the polished wood. Mrs. Whitmore, the colonel's wife, was in the room when it happened. She screamed, not because she was hurt. The jug had not come anywhere near her. She screamed because a slave had broken something that belonged to her, because a black woman had made a mess in her beautiful dining room, because she was hot and irritable and needed someone to punish. She called for Thomas Birch. What happened next was something Zachariah would remember for the rest of his life. Every detail, every sound, every image burned into his brain with permanent fire. He was outside the house, sweeping the front path, when he heard his mother scream. He ran. He was not supposed to run. Slaves were not supposed to run anywhere near the main house. But he heard his mother's voice, and his legs moved before his brain could stop them. He came around the corner of the house and saw them in the yard behind the kitchen. Thomas Birch had his mother tied to a wooden post. Her dress had been torn from her back. Birch was standing behind her with his whip. Mrs. Whitmore was watching from the shade of a pecan tree, fanning herself, a slight smile on her face. Colonel Whitmore stood beside his wife, his arms crossed, looking bored. This was routine for them. This was entertainment. Birch raised the whip and brought it down. The sound it made when it hit flesh was something between a crack and a wet slap. Abigail screamed. Blood appeared on her back, bright red against her dark skin. Birch raised the whip again, and again, and again. Zachariah tried to run to his mother. One of the other overseers grabbed him and held him in place. "Watch, boy," the man said. "Watch what happens when you people forget your place." He watched. He had no choice. He watched as Thomas Birch whipped his mother 37 times. He counted every stroke. He watched her screaming turn to moaning, then to silence. He watched her body go limp against the post. He watched Birch finally stop, breathing hard from the exertion, wiping sweat from his forehead. He watched Colonel Whitmore nod in approval and walk back toward the house with his wife, as if nothing important had happened. They left Abigail tied to the post. She was still breathing, barely. The other slaves were not allowed to help her until nightfall. By then, it was too late. She had lost too much blood. The wounds had already begun to fester in the August heat. She developed a fever that night. By dawn, she was dead. Zachariah was not allowed to attend her burial. He was not allowed to say goodbye. He was sent to the fields that same morning. Colonel Whitmore had decided that 7 was old enough to start picking cotton. There was no time for grief. There was no space for mourning. There was only work. But something had changed inside Zachariah. Something had broken. Or perhaps something had been born. He did not cry. He did not scream. He did not try to run. He went to the fields and picked cotton with hands that were too small for the work. He came back to the cabin that night and lay in the spot where his mother used to sleep. And he made a promise, not to God, not to anyone who might be listening, to himself. He promised that one day he would find Thomas Birch. He would find Colonel Whitmore. He would find everyone who had stood there watching while his mother died. And he would make them pay. Every single one. The next 2 years were the hardest of Zachariah's life. He worked in the fields from sunrise to sunset. The cotton bolls tore at his small fingers until they bled. The Texas sun blistered his skin. The overseers whipped any slave who did not meet their daily quota. Zachariah rarely met his quota. He was too young, too small, too new to the work. He was whipped at least once a week, sometimes more. The scars on his back began to layer over each other, creating a map of pain that covered him from shoulders to waist. But he did not break. That was the thing that the overseers noticed. That was the thing that made them uneasy. Most slaves, when they were whipped repeatedly, developed a certain look in their eyes. A dullness, a defeat. The spirit went out of them. They became docile, compliant, easier to manage. This was the goal of the whippings. Not just to punish, but to destroy the will to resist. Zachariah never got that look. His eyes stayed sharp, focused, alert. When the overseers looked into those eyes, they saw something that disturbed them. They saw hate. Not the hot, explosive hate that made a man do something stupid and get himself killed. This was cold, patient, controlled. Thomas Birch noticed it once and commented to another overseer. "That one's got the devil in him," Birch said. "We're going to have to sell him before he's grown. He's the type that kills masters in their sleep." In 1859, when Zachariah was 9, Colonel Whitmore did something that would haunt Zachariah for the rest of his life. He sold Zachariah's younger sister. Her name was Grace. She was 6 years old. Zachariah had been taking care of her since their mother died. He made sure she ate. He protected her from the older children who might hurt her. He told her stories at night, the same stories their mother used to tell about Moses and freedom and a land where no one was ever sold. Grace was the only family Zachariah had left. She was the only person in the world he loved. One morning, a man came to the plantation in a fancy carriage. His name was William Crawford, and he was a slave trader from Houston. He had come to inspect Colonel Whitmore's slaves and make purchases. This happened regularly on plantations. Slave traders came through like traveling salesmen, looking for bargains, separating families with the stroke of a pen. Crawford walked through the slave quarters with Colonel Whitmore, examining the human merchandise. He squeezed muscles. He checked teeth. He asked about health and temperament. When he saw Grace, he stopped. "That one," he said, pointing. "How much for the girl?" Zachariah watched from 20 feet away. He could not move. He could not speak. Slaves had no right to object when their family members were sold. They had no right to do anything at all. He stood there paralyzed as Colonel Whitmore and William Crawford negotiated the price of his sister. They settled on $400. Grace was taken that same day. She screamed for Zachariah as they put her in the wagon. She reached out her small hands toward him. "Zach, Zach, don't let them take me." He ran toward the wagon. An overseer hit him in the head with the butt of a rifle. When he woke up, Grace was gone. He never saw her again. He never learned where she was taken. He added 2 more names to his list that day: Colonel Whitmore, William Crawford. One day, they would pay. The only thing that kept Zachariah alive during those years was Samuel. Samuel was a slave boy about Zachariah's age, maybe a year older. They had known each other since they were small, but after Zachariah's mother died and his sister was sold, Samuel became something more. He became Zachariah's only friend, his only connection to anything like hope. Samuel was different from Zachariah. Where Zachariah was quiet and watchful, Samuel was talkative and quick to smile. Where Zachariah kept his hate locked deep inside, Samuel seemed to have made peace with their situation. "We can't change what they do to us," Samuel said one night as they lay in the cabin waiting for sleep. "We can only control what's inside us. I'm not going to let them make me hate. That's giving them too much power." Zachariah did not agree. Hate was the only thing keeping him going. But he loved Samuel anyway. Samuel was the one person who could make him laugh. The one person who reminded him that there was still good in the world, even in a place as terrible as this. They made plans together. Whispered plans in the dark. One day, they would escape. They would run north to the free states, or west to the territories where they said a black man could start over. They would find Zachariah's sister and bring her with them. They would build a new life somewhere far away from cotton fields and whips and men like Colonel Whitmore. These plans were probably impossible. They both knew that. But having them, speaking them out loud, made the days bearable. In 1860, when Zachariah was 12, the world outside the plantation began to change. Word filtered down to the slaves through fragments of overheard conversations and news brought by slaves from other plantations. There was talk of war. The northern states and the southern states were fighting over slavery. Some said the North wanted to free all the slaves. Some said there would be no more buying and selling. Some said freedom was coming. Colonel Whitmore grew nervous. He increased the patrols around the plantation. He had the overseers whip anyone caught talking about the war. He said that if any slave tried to escape, he would hunt them down personally and make an example of them that the others would never forget. The message was clear. War or no war, nothing would change on the Whitmore plantation. They were property. They would remain property, and anyone who thought otherwise would suffer. The event that finally broke Zachariah loose happened on a cold night in December of 1860. Samuel had been caught stealing food. It was a piece of bread, that was all. A single piece of bread from the kitchen. Samuel had not eaten in 2 days. He had given his portion to a younger child who was sick. He was hungry. So calm, reasonable voice, the voice he used when he wanted everyone to understand that he was being fair. "Stealing is a crime," he said. "A crime against me, against this plantation, against the natural order that God himself established. This boy has stolen from me, and he will pay the price that God demands." They hanged Samuel from a pecan tree in front of everyone. Thomas Birch put the rope around his neck. 2 other overseers lifted him up and let him drop. Samuel did not die quickly. The drop was not long enough to break his neck. He strangled slowly, his feet kicking, his hands clutching at the rope, his eyes bulging. It took almost 5 minutes. Zachariah was forced to watch the entire time. When it was over, Colonel Whitmore ordered Samuel's body to be left hanging for 3 days. A warning to anyone else who might think about stealing. A reminder of what happened to slaves who forgot their place. For 3 days, Zachariah walked past Samuel's body on his way to and from the fields. He saw the birds come. He saw the flies. He saw what death looked like when it was left to rot in the open air. On the 3rd night, Zachariah made his decision. He waited until the moon went behind the clouds. He crept out of the cabin while everyone else slept. He found a knife in the blacksmith's shed and cut Samuel down from the tree. The body was stiff and beginning to smell. Zachariah did not care. He carried his friend over his shoulder to a spot behind the slave quarters where there was soft earth. He dug a grave with his bare hands. It took him 3 hours. When the hole was deep enough, he placed Samuel inside and covered him with dirt. He did not say a prayer. He did not believe in God anymore, a God who let his mother be whipped to death, a God who let his sister be sold like an animal, a God who let his best friend die for a piece of bread. That was no God worth praying to. But he made another promise. He promised Samuel that his death would mean something. He promised that he would escape, he would survive. He would come back one day and make every single person on this plantation answer for what they had done. Then Zachariah ran. He had no plan. He had no supplies. He had nothing but the clothes on his back and the hate in his heart. He crawled under the fence at the western edge of the plantation and started moving. West. Always west. Away from the fields. Away from the whips. Away from everything he had ever known. He was 13 years old. He was alone in the Texas wilderness. He had never been off the plantation in his entire life. He did not know how to hunt. He did not know how to find water. He did not know where he was going or how he would get there. He knew only that he would rather die free than live another day as a slave. The first 3 days were the worst. Zachariah moved at night and hid during the day, knowing that the overseers would be searching for him. He had no food. He found water in a creek and drank until his stomach hurt. He ate berries that he hoped were not poisonous. He kept moving west, navigating by the stars the way Samuel had taught him during their whispered conversations about escape. On the 4th day, he heard the dogs. Colonel Whitmore had hired slave catchers, professional hunters who specialized in tracking escaped slaves. They had hounds trained to follow human scent for miles. They had horses and guns and experience. They had caught dozens of runaways over the years. They had never failed. Zachariah heard the baying of the hounds coming from the east. He knew what it meant. He knew he could not outrun dogs. He knew that if they caught him, he would be brought back to the plantation. He would be whipped. He might be hanged like Samuel. At best, he would be branded as a runaway and sold further south to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana, where slaves were worked to death within a few years. He ran anyway. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. He fell in a dry creek bed and could not get up. The baying grew louder. They were getting closer. He could hear the horses now. The shouts of the men. He was going to be caught. Then he saw the hole. It was a gap in the creek bank, partially hidden by roots and dead leaves. A hole just big enough for a boy to squeeze into. Zachariah did not hesitate. He pushed himself into the hole, wiggling through the narrow opening until he was completely hidden. He found himself in a small underground space, barely big enough to sit up. It was dark. It smelled of earth and rot. Something skittered over his foot, probably a snake or a rat. He did not move. He did not breathe. The dogs reached the creek bed minutes later. He could hear them sniffing, howling, confused. The water in the creek had washed away his scent. The hole was downwind. The dogs circled and barked but could not find him. The slave catchers cursed and kicked at their animals. He went into the water, one of them said. Could be anywhere by now. Spread out. Check downstream. They moved on. Zachariah stayed in the hole for 6 more hours until long after the sounds had faded. When he finally emerged, the sun was setting. He was alive. He was free. and he was more alone than he had ever been in his life. For the next 3 years, Zachariah survived in the wilderness of West Texas. This was not the civilized Texas of cotton plantations and southern gentlemen. This was the frontier. Vast stretches of desert and scrubland where few white men had settled. Comanche territory. Outlaw country. A place where a black boy with no papers and no protector could disappear completely. He learned to survive the hard way. By trial and error. By nearly dying and figuring out what he had done wrong. He learned which plants were edible and which would kill you. He learned to find water by watching where the animals went. He learned to catch small game with traps made from sticks and vines. He learned to make fire with flint and steel taken from an abandoned camp. He learned to read tracks, to sense when predators were near, to move through the landscape without leaving a trace. The wilderness was brutal, but it was honest. It did not hate him for being black. It did not think he was property. It simply was. Survive or die. Adapt or perish. There were no masters here, no overseers, no whips. Just the land and the sky and the struggle to see another sunrise. He encountered other people occasionally, outlaws hiding from the law, Comanche hunting parties. Mexican traders moving goods across the border. Some tried to hurt him, some tried to help. He learned to read people the way he read tracks, to know within seconds whether someone meant him harm. He became hard, watchful, dangerous. The soft parts of him, the parts that had once known how to love and trust, retreated deep inside where nothing could touch them. By the time he was 15, Zachariah had survived things that would have killed most grown men. He had been bitten by a rattlesnake and cut the venom out of his own leg with a stolen knife. He had nearly frozen to death during a blue norther that dropped temperatures 40 degrees in an hour. He had fought off a mountain lion with nothing but a sharpened stick. He had killed 2 men who tried to rob him and sell him back into slavery. Yes, he had killed. The first time was the hardest. A white man in a ragged coat who found him sleeping in a cave and decided that a black boy alone in the wilderness was easy money. The man had a knife and a rope and a smile that said he had done this before. Zachariah had only a rock. But the man underestimated him. They always underestimated him. By the time the fight was over, the man was dead and Zachariah was holding the knife. He felt nothing. No guilt, no horror. Just a cold satisfaction that one more person who wanted to hurt him could not hurt anyone ever again. The second killing was easier. The third, easier still. Zachariah was becoming something. He did not have a word for it yet, but he could feel it growing inside him. A capacity for violence that had been planted the day his mother died and had been watered by every cruelty since. In the spring of 1863, half dead from fever and starvation, Zachariah stumbled into the camp of a man who would change his life. The man was Mexican, old, gray-haired. He sat by a small fire in a canyon deep in the mountains, roasting a rabbit on a stick. He had a rifle across his knees and 2 revolvers on his belt. His face was weathered and scarred. His eyes had the look of someone who had seen too much death and made peace with it. Zachariah collapsed at the edge of the firelight. He was too weak to run, too weak to fight. If this man wanted to kill him, there was nothing he could do about it. But the old man did not reach for his weapons. He simply watched the boy lying in the dirt, this skeleton wrapped in dark skin, this wild creature with burning eyes. After a long moment, the old man spoke. "You look like death, boy. You plan to die in my camp?" Zachariah found the strength to answer. "Not planning to die anywhere." "Not yet." The old man smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who recognized something familiar. "Good," he said. "Dying is easy. Living is the hard part." He tossed a piece of rabbit meat toward Zachariah. Eat. You're too skinny to be worth killing. Maybe when you fatten up, I'll change my mind. The old man's name was Joe Joaquin Esperanza was not supposed to exist anymore. According to the authorities in 3 Mexican states and 2 American territories, he had been dead for over a decade. He had been reported killed in Chihuahua in 1851, then again in Sonora in 1854, then once more in New Mexico Territory in 1857. Each report was convincing, each came with witnesses and details, and each was completely false. Joaquin Esperanza had simply become very good at disappearing. In his youth, Joaquin had been something like a legend. He rode with various groups of irregulars and bandits along the border during the Mexican-American War. After the war ended in 1848, and Mexico lost half its territory to the United States, Joaquin continued fighting, not for any government, not for any cause, for revenge. He watched American settlers take land that had belonged to his family for generations. He watched Mexican farmers driven off their property at gunpoint. He watched a way of life destroyed by men who believed that their white skin gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. So Joaquin took back. He robbed stagecoaches carrying gold from California. He ambushed army patrols that strayed too far from their forts. He killed men who deserved killing and some who probably did not. He became a ghost story that American mothers told their children to keep them from wandering too far from home. He became a name that made lawmen nervous and politicians angry. But revenge is exhausting. Violence takes a toll on the soul, even when it is justified. By the time Joaquin reached his 40s, he was tired. Tired of running, tired of killing, tired of waking up every morning wondering if this would be the day someone finally collected the bounty on his head. He staged his own death one final time and retreated into the mountains of West Texas. He built a small cabin in a canyon so remote that even the Comanche rarely passed through. He lived alone. He hunted. He grew vegetables in a small garden. He tried to forget everything he had been. Then Zachariah Creed collapsed at the edge of his campfire, and Joaquin saw something that made forgetting impossible. "You have the eyes," Joaquin said one evening, about a week after Zachariah had arrived. The boy had recovered enough to sit up and eat solid food. He was still weak, but the fever had broken. He would survive. "What eyes?" Zachariah asked. "The eyes of a man who has already decided to kill. I have seen these eyes before, in my own mirror many years ago." Joaquin poked at the fire with a stick. Sparks rose into the darkness. "Who do you want to kill, boy? And why?" Zachariah was silent for a long time. He had not spoken about his past to anyone. He had not spoken much at all during his years in the wilderness. But something about this old Mexican made him want to talk. Maybe it was the recognition in Joaquin's eyes. Maybe it was the simple fact that for the first time in years, someone had shown him kindness without wanting anything in return. Whatever the reason, Zachariah opened his mouth and let the story pour out. He told Joaquin everything. His Birch, William Crawford, Colonel Henry Whitmore, and others. The overseers who had whipped him, the slave catchers who had hunted him, every man who had treated him as property instead of a person. When Zachariah finished, Joaquin was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled between them. An owl called somewhere in the darkness. Finally, the old man spoke. "You want revenge? I understand this. I have wanted revenge for most of my life. But wanting is not enough. Wanting will only get you killed." Joaquin looked at Zachariah with an expression that was almost sad. "You are angry. You are determined. But you are also untrained, unskilled. You would not last 5 minutes against the men you want to kill. They have guns. They have money. They have the law on their side. You have nothing but hate." "Then teach me," Zachariah said. Teach me to be more than I am." Joaquin shook his head. "I came here to escape violence, to find peace, to die quietly in these mountains and let my sins be forgotten." "Then why did you save me? Why didn't you let me die?" The question hung in the air. Joaquin stared into the fire for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "Because I saw myself in you," he said quietly. "Because I know what it is to have everything taken. Because I was once a boy with nothing but hate, and someone helped me when they did not have to. I suppose I am repaying a debt I have owed for 40 years. He sighed and stood up slowly, his joints cracking with age. "I will teach you, but understand what you are asking. Once you walk this path, there is no coming back. The things I will teach you will change you forever. You will become a killer, and killers do not have the luxury of peace. Not in this life, maybe not in the next." Zachariah did not hesitate. "I stopped hoping for peace the day my mother died. All I want now is justice." Joaquin nodded slowly. "Then we begin tomorrow." The training lasted 4 years. 4 years of brutal, relentless education in the art of violence. Joaquin was not a gentle teacher. He did not believe in gentle. He believed that pain was the best instructor, that lessons learned through suffering were lessons never forgotten. He pushed Zachariah to the edge of his limits, then pushed him further. He broke the boy down and built him back up into something harder, something sharper, something deadly. The first year focused on the body. Zachariah learned to fight with his hands, with knives, with sticks, with anything that could be turned into a weapon. Joaquin taught him techniques from a dozen different traditions. Street fighting from the slums of Mexico City, knife work from the vaqueros, wrestling holds from the Comanche, pressure points that could paralyze or kill with a single strike. Every day they sparred until Zachariah could barely stand. Every night he nursed his bruises and prepared for the next day's beating. The second year focused on firearms. Joaquin was a master with both rifle and pistol, and he passed this mastery to his student. Zachariah learned to shoot at targets while standing still, then while moving, then while being shot at. He learned to draw and fire in a single fluid motion, so fast that the eye could barely follow. He learned to reload without looking, to clear jams by feel, to maintain his weapons in any condition. By the end of the second year, Zachariah could put 6 bullets through a playing card at 20 paces in less than 3 seconds. Joaquin said he was adequate. The third year focused on the mind. This was the training that Zachariah had not expected. Joaquin insisted that violence without intelligence was just noise. A true fighter needed to understand his enemies, needed to predict their movements, needed to control his own emotions so completely that nothing could disturb his focus. They played chess for hours, Joaquin teaching Zachariah to think several moves ahead. They studied strategy and tactics, discussing battles and ambushes from history. They practiced meditation, sitting motionless for hours until Zachariah could quiet the storm inside his head and find perfect stillness. But the most important lesson came in the third year, and it had nothing to do with fighting at all. It was about patience. "Revenge is not a fire," Joaquin said one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the canyon walls orange and red. "Fire burns hot and fast and destroys itself. Revenge is a coal. You keep it alive inside you, small and controlled, feeding it just enough to keep it glowing. You wait, you watch, you prepare. And when the moment is right, when everything is in place, then you blow on that coal and let it become an inferno. Not before. Never before." Zachariah took this lesson to heart. He had been burning with impatience for years, wanting to rush back to Texas and start killing immediately. Joaquin taught him to convert that urgency into focus. Every day of training was a step closer to his goal. Every skill mastered was another weapon in his arsenal. Rushing would only get him killed. Patience would get him everything he wanted. The fourth year was about putting it all together. Joaquin staged elaborate scenarios in the mountains, testing Zachariah's ability to plan, infiltrate, and execute missions against imaginary enemies. He brought in old contacts from his bandit days, former fighters who were willing to play the role of guards and targets. Zachariah learned to scout a location before attacking, to identify escape routes, to anticipate complications, to improvise when plans fell apart. By the end of the fourth year, he was no longer a student. He was a weapon, honed and sharpened and ready to be used. On the day Zachariah turned 20, Joaquin called him to the fire for a final conversation. The old man looked older than ever. His hair had gone completely white during their years together. His hands trembled slightly now. He moved more slowly, more carefully. Time was catching up with him. "You are ready," Joaquin said. "As ready as I can make you. What you do now is your choice. But I want you to understand something before you go." Zachariah waited. "When I was young, I killed many men. Some deserved it. Some probably did not. I told myself I was fighting for justice, for my people, for revenge against those who had wronged us. And maybe some of that was true. But here is what I have learned in my old age." Joaquin paused, gathering his words. "Killing changes you. Every life you take carves something out of your soul. You don't notice at first. You feel powerful, righteous. But over time, you realize that parts of you are missing. The parts that could feel joy, the parts that could love, the parts that could imagine a future beyond the next target." He looked at Zachariah with eyes that held decades of regret. "I am not telling you not to go. The men who hurt you deserve to die. I believe this. But I want you to know the cost. When you are finished, if you survive, you will not be the same person who started. You may not like who you become. And there is no going back." Zachariah considered this for a long moment. He thought about his mother's face, his sister's screams as she was taken away, Samuel's body swinging from the tree. He thought about every scar on his back, every night he had spent alone and afraid, every piece of himself that had already been taken before he ever killed anyone. "They already took everything from me," he said finally. "Whatever is left, I'm willing to spend. Whatever I become, I'm willing to live with. They made me this way. They can die by what they created." Joaquin nodded slowly. He reached into his coat and pulled out 2 revolvers. They were Colt 1851 Navy models, beautifully maintained, with ivory grips that had yellowed with age. "These were mine when I was young. They have killed more men than I can count. Now they are yours." He handed them to Zachariah with something like ceremony. "Use them well. And when you are finished, if you find that you want to live, come back to these mountains. I will probably be dead by then. But the cabin will still be here. The garden will still be here. A place to rest if you ever want to stop running." Zachariah took the guns. They felt perfect in his hands, balanced, deadly, extensions of his will. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Joaquin smiled his thin, sad smile. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you've survived." 3 days later, Zachariah Creed rode out of the mountains and back into the world of men. He carried Joaquin's revolvers on his hips, a rifle on his back, and a list of names in his head. The first name on that list was Thomas Birch. It took Zachariah 2 months to find him. After the war ended in 1865 and slavery was abolished, the old plantation system collapsed. Many former overseers scattered across Texas, looking for new opportunities in a changed world. Birch had drifted west, eventually settling in a dusty little town called Dusty Creek, about 100 miles from where the Whitmore plantation used to be. He worked as a ranch hand now, drinking away his wages and telling anyone who would listen about the good old days when he kept slaves in line. Zachariah watched him for a week before making his move. He observed Birch's routines. When he woke up, where he ate, which saloon he drank at, who his friends were, whether he carried a gun. The answer to the last question was yes, a worn pistol that Birch kept on his hip more out of habit than skill. Zachariah noted that Birch's draw was slow. His reflexes were dulled by years of alcohol. He was not a threat. On the 7th day, Zachariah walked into the saloon at noon. The room was crowded with ranch hands and drifters seeking shade from the brutal Texas sun. Birch sat at a table in the back, playing cards with 3 other men. He was heavier than Zachariah remembered. His face was red and bloated from drink, but those hands were the same, the hands that had held the whip, the hands that had killed his mother. The room grew quiet as Zachariah approached. A black man walking into a white saloon was unusual enough. A black man dressed all in black with 2 pistols gleaming on his hips, moving with the confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. That was something else entirely. Zachariah stopped at Birch's table. The card players looked up nervously. Birch squinted at the stranger, too drunk to feel the danger. "Thomas Birch," Zachariah said. It was not a question. "Who wants to know?" Birch slurred. "You worked as an overseer on the Whitmore plantation, before the war." Something flickered in Birch's eyes. A memory, a ghost. He straightened up slightly, trying to focus. "What of it?" "That was a long time ago." "Not long enough." Zachariah's voice was calm, almost gentle. "August 18th, 1858. You whipped a woman named Abigail 37 times. She died that night from her wounds." Birch's face went pale. His hand started moving toward his pistol. But before his fingers touched the grip, he was looking down the barrel of Zachariah's Colt. The draw had been too fast to see. One moment Zachariah's hands were empty, the next death was pointing at Birch's face. "I wouldn't," Zachariah said quietly. The other card players scrambled away from the table, knocking over chairs in their haste to get clear. The rest of the saloon had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching now. "Who are you?" Birch whispered. Zachariah leaned in close. "Abigail was my mother. My name is Zachariah. It means God remembers." He watched recognition dawn in Birch's eyes. Terror followed close behind. "I told you once that I would find you. Did you think I forgot? Did you think God forgot?" Birch started to beg. His words tumbled out in a desperate stream. He was sorry. He was just following orders. He was different now. He had changed. "Please, please." Zachariah listened until the words ran out. Then he shook his head slowly. "My mother begged too. You didn't stop." "Why should I?" The gunshot echoed through the silent room. Birch slumped forward onto the table, a hole in the center of his forehead. The card players were spattered with blood. Someone screamed. Zachariah holstered his weapon calmly, turned, and walked out the front door into the blinding sunlight. By the time anyone thought to follow, he had vanished. The news spread across Texas like wildfire. A black man had walked into a white saloon in broad daylight and killed a white man. Not in self-defense, not in a fair fight. An execution, cold-blooded and deliberate. The victim was a former overseer from a plantation. The killer was a former slave. And he had escaped without a trace. Within a week, wanted posters appeared in every town. $500 for information, leading to the capture of the man they were calling the Black Ghost. But no one had gotten a good enough look at him. No one knew his name. He was just a tall, dark shadow that killed and disappeared. Zachariah did not care about the posters. He was already moving to the next name on his list. William Crawford, the slave trader who had bought his sister Grace, was harder to find. The slave trade had ended with the war, and many traders had moved on to other businesses. Crawford had reinvented himself as a legitimate businessman in Houston, dealing in cotton and cattle. He lived in a fine house on a respectable street, attended church every Sunday, and was considered an upstanding member of the community. No one talked about how he had made his original fortune. No one wanted to remember. Zachariah spent 3 weeks gathering information. He learned Crawford's schedule, his habits, his security. The man was more careful than Birch had been. He kept armed guards at his house. He traveled with protection. He was afraid, though perhaps not of Zachariah specifically. Men who built their wealth on human suffering tend to have many enemies. The solution came to Zachariah one night as he watched Crawford's house from across the street. Every Tuesday evening, Crawford visited a private club on the edge of town, a place where wealthy men drank expensive whiskey and discussed business away from prying eyes. Crawford always went alone to these meetings. His guards waited outside. This was his vulnerability. On a Tuesday in October of 1873, Zachariah entered the club through a back window while the staff was distracted with the evening service. He moved through the shadows like the ghost people were calling him, avoiding the few servants and club employees. He found Crawford in a private room, sitting alone with a glass of bourbon, waiting for his associates to arrive. Crawford looked up when the door opened. His eyes widened when he saw the tall black man in black clothing. He was not stupid. He had heard about the killing in Dusty Creek. He knew immediately why this stranger was here. "You're him," Crawford breathed. "The one they're looking for." Zachariah closed the door behind him. "William Crawford, in 1859, you came to the Whitmore plantation and purchased a 6-year-old girl named Grace. You paid $400 for her." Crawford's hand moved toward the bell on the table, the one that would summon his guards. Zachariah drew and fired in a single motion. The bullet shattered Crawford's wrist. The man screamed, clutching his bleeding hand. "That was a warning," Zachariah said. "The next one won't be. Where is she?" Crawford was sobbing now, tears and snot running down his face. "Who? I don't know what you're talking about. I bought and sold hundreds of slaves." "Do you expect me to remember one?" "Her name was Grace. She was my sister. You took her from the Whitmore plantation. Where did she go?" Crawford shook his head desperately. "I don't know. I don't keep records of individual sales. She could have been sold anywhere. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. I don't remember." Zachariah studied the man's face. He was telling the truth. He genuinely did not remember. Grace had been nothing to him, just merchandise, just $400 changing hands. He had probably forgotten her name before his carriage left the plantation. Something inside Zachariah went very cold. He had hoped, despite everything, that Crawford might have some information, some clue that would help him find his sister. Instead, he had found only emptiness. Grace was gone, lost in the vast machinery of slavery. He would probably never know what happened to her. "You don't even remember," Zachariah said softly. "She was 6 years old. She screamed for me when you took her." She reached out her hands. "And you don't even remember." Crawford must have seen death in Zachariah's eyes. He started babbling again, offering money, offering to help search for the girl, offering anything, everything. "Please." Zachariah raised his pistol. "When you get to hell, tell them Zachariah sent you. Tell them God remembers." The second shot was as clean as the first. Over the next 18 months, Zachariah worked his way through the list. James Thornton, the sheriff who had ordered Samuel's hanging, was found dead in his office with a note pinned to his chest that read, "Remembered." Robert Hayes, a doctor who had branded runaway slaves on the face, was discovered in his clinic with his own branding iron pressed into his forehead. 2 former overseers from the Whitmore plantation died within a week of each other, one shot in a stable, one shot in his own bedroom. The pattern was always the same: a single bullet, a message, a ghost that could not be caught. The legend of Zachariah Vengeance Creed grew with each killing. Some said he was a demon summoned by slave magic. Some said he was a dead man come back from the grave. Some said he did not exist at all, that the killings were the work of multiple men who had adopted a single identity. The truth was stranger. He was just a man who had been wronged. A man who had decided that if the law would not provide justice, he would provide it himself. Not everyone Zachariah killed was on his original list. Word of his existence spread through the black communities of Texas, passed in whispers from church to church, from family to family. Sometimes, people sought him out. They told him about men who had committed terrible crimes during slavery, masters who had murdered slaves for sport, overseers who had raped women and killed their husbands, traders who had specialized in separating children from mothers. These men had never faced any consequences. The law did not consider crimes against slaves to be crimes at all. Zachariah listened to these stories. He investigated when he could, and when he found that the stories were true, he added names to his list. He became something more than a personal avenger. He became a symbol, a promise that the crimes of slavery would not be forgotten, that somewhere out there, someone was keeping count. Someone was remembering, and someone was making the guilty pay. The bounty on his head rose to $1,000, then $2,000, then $5,000. The governor of Texas declared him public enemy number 1. Possess were formed, bounty hunters were hired, rangers were deployed. None of them could catch him. Zachariah moved like smoke, appearing and disappearing at will. He had learned from Joaquin how to survive in the wilderness. He had contacts in the black communities who provided shelter and information. He was everywhere and nowhere. A nightmare that would not end. By the summer of 1875, only one name remained on Zachariah's original list: Colonel Henry Whitmore. Whitmore had not done well after the war. The Emancipation Proclamation freed his slaves. The Union victory destroyed his fortune. The cotton market collapsed. He was forced to sell most of his land to pay debts. The grand plantation house fell into disrepair. The fields went fallow. By 1875, Whitmore was a shell of his former self, living in a crumbling mansion with a handful of hired guns, spending his days drinking and cursing the world that had taken everything from him. But Whitmore was not stupid. He knew his name was on Zachariah's list. He had heard about the deaths of Birch and Crawford and all the others. He knew that sooner or later the ghost would come for him. So he prepared. He hired the best gunfighters he could afford. 20 men, each with a reputation for violence. He fortified his mansion with barricades and firing positions. He set up a rotation of guards who watched the approaches day and night. He turned his decaying plantation into a fortress, determined to make his last stand there if necessary. "Let him come," Whitmore told his men, a glass of whiskey trembling in his age-spotted hand. "Let that animal come. I'll show him what happens when property forgets its place. I'll hang his body from the same tree where I hung that stealing boy all those years ago. Let him come." On the night of September 15th, 1875, Zachariah came. He approached the plantation from the west, moving through the overgrown cotton fields that had once been tended by slaves. The moon was full, but hidden by clouds, casting the world in darkness. He could see the lights of the mansion in the distance. He could see the silhouettes of guards on the porch and at the windows, 20 men, all armed, all waiting for him. Zachariah smiled. He had faced worse odds. He began picking off the outer guards one by one. A shot from the darkness, a body falling, silence. The other guards spun toward the sound, but there was nothing to see. Another shot, another body, then another. Panic began to spread. Men who had been confident in their numbers started to realize that numbers meant nothing against an enemy they could not see. Within 10 minutes, 8 men were dead. The remaining 12 had retreated inside the mansion, barricading the doors and windows. They fired blindly into the darkness, wasting ammunition on shadows. They shouted at each other, their voices high with fear. Zachariah circled the house, patient as a wolf. He fired through windows, picking off anyone foolish enough to show themselves. He set fire to the kitchen building, filling the night with smoke and confusion. He shot out the lanterns one by one, plunging the mansion into darkness. By midnight, only 4 gunfighters were left. They huddled in the main parlor with Whitmore, their backs to each other, their guns pointed at every door and window. The old colonel was shaking uncontrollably now. The whiskey had worn off. The reality of his situation had set in. He was going to die tonight. All his money, all his hired guns, all his preparations meant nothing against this demon he had created. Zachariah's voice came from somewhere in the darkness outside. "Send out Whitmore. The rest of you can leave. This is between me and him." The 4 gunfighters looked at each other. They looked at Whitmore. They made their decision quickly. One of them grabbed the old man and started dragging him toward the door. "No," Whitmore screamed. "No, you can't. I paid you." "You didn't pay us enough for this," the gunfighter said. He threw open the front door and shoved Whitmore out into the night. Then he and his companions ran out the back, disappearing into the darkness, leaving the colonel alone. Whitmore lay in the dirt of his own front yard, weeping. His fine clothes were stained. His white hair was wild. His hands clawed at the ground as if trying to dig a hole to hide in. He looked nothing like the powerful man who had once owned 112 human beings. He looked like what he was, a pathetic old coward facing the consequences of a lifetime of cruelty. Zachariah emerged from the shadows. He walked slowly, deliberately, savoring this moment. He had waited 17 years for this, since the day his mother died, since the day his sister was taken, since the day Samuel was hanged. 17 years of pain and survival and preparation, all leading to this. He stopped a few feet from Whitmore. The old man looked up at him, his eyes red with tears. "Please," Whitmore whispered. "Please don't kill me. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry." Zachariah stood over him for a long moment, looking down at the man who had caused so much suffering. He remembered his mother's face, her voice singing hymns in the morning, her whisper in his ear telling him that God remembers. He remembered Grace's small hands reaching for him. He remembered Samuel's body swinging from the tree. He remembered every scar on his back, every night of hunger, every moment of fear and pain and loss. Then Zachariah did something he had not planned, something that surprised even himself. He holstered his gun. "I'm not going to kill you," he said. Whitmore looked up, confused, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "You're not? Then you'll let me go?" Zachariah shook his head slowly. "No, you're not going anywhere. You're going to live, Whitmore. You're going to live right here, in this ruin you used to call home. You're going to watch everything you built crumble to dust. You're going to wake up every morning knowing that you lost everything. Your slaves, your money, your power, your pride, all of it gone. And you're going to spend the rest of your miserable life looking over your shoulder, wondering if I'll change my mind, wondering if this is the day I come back to finish what I started." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Death is too easy for you. You don't get to escape that quickly. You get to live. And every day you live, you'll remember this moment. You'll remember that a slave stood over you while you groveled in the dirt. You'll remember that your property beat you. And when you finally die, old and alone and forgotten, the last thing you'll see is my mother's face. Because God remembers, and now you will too." Zachariah turned and walked away. Behind him, Whitmore collapsed into the dirt, sobbing. The mansion burned through the night, sending flames high into the Texas sky. True to Zachariah's word, Whitmore lived. He was found the next morning, wandering the ruins of his plantation, muttering to himself. He spent the remaining years of his life in a sanatorium, tormented by nightmares and visions. The doctors said his mind had broken. They said he screamed about a man in black who was coming to get him. They said he died alone in 1883, calling out for mercy to someone only he could see. As for Zachariah Creed, he disappeared after that night. The killings stopped. The ghost vanished. Bounty hunters searched for years but found nothing. Some said he had been killed in Mexico. Some said he had gone north to Canada. Some said he had never existed at all, that he was just a story slaves told to frighten their former masters. But in the black communities of Texas, a different story was passed down. A story about a man who returned to the mountains where an old Mexican gunfighter had taught him everything he knew. They said he found the cabin still standing, the garden still growing. They said he buried Joaquin Esperanza with his own hands in a grave overlooking the canyon where they had spent 4 years together. They said he hung up his guns and never killed again. Some said he started helping escaped slaves make their way north. Some said he became a protector of black communities, appearing whenever trouble came and disappearing when it was over. Some said he lived to be very old, a quiet man with sad eyes who never spoke about his past, but who moved with the grace of someone who had been trained to kill. Whether any of this is true, no one knows for certain. The records are incomplete. The witnesses are long dead. All we have is the legend. The legend of Zachariah Vengeance Creed. The boy who watched his mother die. The slave who escaped and learned to fight. The ghost who returned to make the guilty pay. The man who chose mercy when he had every reason to choose death. His story is not just about revenge. It is about what slavery did to people, to the enslaved and to the enslavers. It is about the violence that was woven into the fabric of American society for 250 years. It is about the debts that were never paid and the crimes that were never punished. It is about children who were stolen from their parents and parents who never stopped searching for their children. Every name on Zachariah's list was a real type of person who existed in the slavery system. The overseers who wielded the whips. The traders who tore families apart. The masters who believed they had the right to own human beings. These people were not aberrations. They were the system working as designed. And when that system ended, when the 13th Amendment declared slavery abolished, most of them faced no consequences at all. They kept their land, they kept their money, they kept their social standing. They simply adapted to new forms of exploitation and continued as before. Zachariah Creed represents something that the system feared above all else. The idea that the enslaved might remember, that they might return, that there might be a price to pay for centuries of cruelty. This fear haunted white Southerners throughout the era of slavery and beyond. It drove them to create ever more oppressive laws and ever more brutal systems of control. They knew deep down that what they were doing was wrong, and they knew that wrongdoing sooner or later demands an accounting. The story of Zachariah is fictional, but the world he inhabited was real. The violence he experienced was real. The systems he fought against were real. The children who were stolen, the families who were destroyed, the lives that were crushed under the weight of slavery, all of that was real. And the descendants of those children, those families, those crushed lives, they are still here. Still carrying the weight of that history. Still waiting for an accounting that has never come. When Zachariah's mother named him, she chose a name that meant God remembers. She believed that someday, somehow, justice would come. That the suffering of her people would not be forgotten. That the crimes committed against them would not go unpunished forever. She did not live to see that justice. Neither did Zachariah, not really. The men he killed were a tiny fraction of those responsible for slavery. The system itself continued in new forms for generations after his story ended. But the name remains. Zachariah. God remembers. And now you remember too. You know this story. You know what was done. You know the names of the guilty and the faces of the innocent. You know that slavery did not simply end in 1865. It evolved, it adapted, it found new ways to extract black labor and destroy black families. And some of that evolution continues to this day. The question that Zachariah's story asks is not whether revenge is justified. That is a question each person must answer for themselves. The question is simpler and harder. Will we remember? Will we face the truth of what was done? Will we acknowledge the debts that were never paid and the wounds that were never healed? Will we build a future that honors the suffering of the past? Zachariah Creed found his own answer in the mountains of West Texas. He chose vengeance, then chose mercy, then chose silence. He disappeared into history, leaving only a legend behind. But legends have power. They remind us of what is possible. They remind us that even in the darkest times, there are those who refuse to submit, those who fight back, those who remember. His mother's voice still echoes across the years. God remembers every hurt, every tear, every wrong done to his children. And one day, he will make it right. The story of Zachariah Creed is over. But the story of America, the story of slavery and its aftermath, the story of injustice and the long struggle for justice, that story continues. It continues in every black family that carries the trauma of ancestors they never knew. It continues in every community that still fights for equality. It continues in every classroom where this history is taught and every living room where it is discussed. It continues in you, now that you know. Remember. That is all the dead have ever asked of us. Remember what was done. Remember who did it. Remember who suffered. And build a world where it can